Our nonprofit is entirely remote and staff works across the country. We're running into issues about where to store physical items. As the founder, I've long stored stuff in my home. However, my goal is to turn over all logistics, including the shipping of physical items, to our operations manager. While she has plenty of space, she doesn't want to have work stuff in her home. I understand her point. However, if you work from home, you need a home office. She's suggesting a storage unit. We don't have enough stuff to really justify a storage unit, but I'm open to suggestions. Obviously, I cannot make her store extra items in her home. While most of our paperwork is now digital, the items we need stored are for events, our own swag, gifts for donors and volunteers, just to name a few things.
This is a tough question. I'm sitting here struggling with it because I don't have an easy answer because that is a dilemma. I can share what I have heard. Others say they do in these kinds of situations. So I know some, when everyone or organizations started to go remote, particularly if staff were around the country, they might have like a stipend or like kind of like a monthly work from home stipend, that part of that stipend could actually be for space or like creating some kind of storage unit space or bookcase or something or whatever you need, shelving in someone's house. So if the pushback from her is just like, I don't want to have to, if it's truly I don't have the space or don't want to use my current space for this, then yeah, that's a larger issue. If it's more about like, why should I have to do this, then maybe a stipend would help. I also think sometimes, because it sounds like you're saying that you're going to move everything over to her, like as the ops manager. And so is there some kind of small co-working space or something? Sometimes those co-working spaces have like a closet or something you can kind of rent out. So that's not a full storage unit. I also think perhaps is there somebody else that is in the neighborhood or near this person that could, perhaps it's like another community organization that would be willing to rent out as part of their space if they have extra space. So I'm just thinking of things like that to try to solve for this. But I realize there's not an easy solution, especially if she's being pretty stubborn, which it sounds like she is about this. And you can't force her to do any of it, but you would kind of hope she would try to make it work. I don't know. Andy, do you have any ideas?
Not really. Especially because you're working across the country. I don't even see how a storage space works. It's unless, the stuff that you need to store are things that you're sending to people, like gifts and swag and that kind of junk. It feels like whoever's sending it out should have it sort of nearby. Yeah, I don't know. It would be, I think, your suggestion of finding somebody that maybe has a closet you could borrow. Maybe it's a board member, but it should be near the person who's doing the shipping of it, right? I don't know. This feels like, this is a really hard one. I don't know.
It is. It is. And, and I feel like there's some people that say like, just as a matter of policy, they don't want organizational items stored in people's homes, right? Because there should be some kind of central place, but that makes sense if you're all in the same location or community. Yeah. I think it makes this so much more complicated if you're in different spaces around the country, or different locations around the country, which is what it sounds like you are. So, perhaps the solution is that every single person that has the stuff they need to store, they have their own closet in the community center or whatever, or their board member's office, like you said, Andy, that person finds their own solution for that community, and maybe you budget for that. Like, I don't know what else you do, especially because you need access. You need quick access depending on it, unless you can all, it sounds like maybe in this question that they also are sort of trying to centralize all of the stuff, like the quote stuff that needs to be stored is moving to this one person, the ops director. So maybe the ops director or whatever is the one that truly comes up with their own solution. Like, okay, if you don't want to use your house, I get that. Here's like one option is we give you a stipend. Another option is to create your own sort of storage unit within your house, or find another solution and here's some ideas. I mean, that's all I can think of. And I would love to know if any of our listeners have a solution to this that we're not thinking of, or maybe you're in a similar situation. I would love to hear it.
The only other thing, as you're saying that, the only other thing that occurred to me is like, so there are businesses that allow you to hold business records, like records retention places that just have giant warehouses that are full of bankers boxes with junk in them, like paperwork and that kind of stuff. So that would be a solution for things that you just need to have stored, something that's part of your records retention policy. You need to keep this for 7 years. So you put it someplace like that, and then it just stays there because you never really need it. You can ask for it back and they'll ship it back to you. And then depending on how much swag you have, I mean, there are other organizations that do. So a lot of times it's something like cold storage where you can rent cold storage. So food banks do this all the time. If they don't have enough storage space for the stuff they need, they can rent cold storage from a company that just has a big warehouse. You put your stuff in it and they'll drop ship it from whatever the warehouse is out to where it's supposed to go. But they don't usually work in like, it's not a coffee mug. They're not going to ship coffee mugs, but there may be. I mean, I don't know. You might look around and see if there's anybody that does that. So like say you've got like an Etsy store or something and you've got some things, but you don't want to store them at your own place. Maybe there's a business out there that does that just can be the drop ship for coffee mugs and stuff like that. I mean, if not, maybe that's a good business idea for somebody. I don't know, but that's the only other thing I can think of.
Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board.
Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing.
Nonprofit resources.
Welcome to Nonprofit Everything, the podcast where hosts Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding answer your questions about all things nonprofit.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. I'm Andy Shurick. I'm here with Stacey Wedding, and we're here to help answer nonprofit questions. So the way this works is you send us questions. You can do that at questions@nonprofiteverything.com, or hit us up on social media, or find us literally any other way. And we will do our best to get those questions answered. If Stacey and I can't do it, we will go and rope in some experts. Send us questions that are hard. Send us questions that are easy. Send us questions that you think you already know the answer to, but you want us to answer anyway, just to see if we get it wrong. We could do that too. We really appreciate that you've taken the time to listen to the podcast. Please let us know. Is there something we can do differently? Something we can do better that you'd like us to do? We need that feedback. That's the way we make the podcast better. And with that, we're going to jump right in.
I work with a small and diverse team, including many different ages. I seem to be most challenged as a Gen Xer with my younger colleagues. As an example, I consider it a common courtesy to speak to my supervisor before requesting more than 2 consecutive days off for non-emergencies. Some of my younger colleagues think that because they have the paid time off, they can take it whenever they want. We're a small team and we have to manage everyone accordingly. We're fleshing out our PTO policy to ensure more open communication before people submit for vacations. What are your thoughts about the PTO policy and also how to navigate generational differences in the workplace?
So I'm not going to talk about generational differences because that makes me crazy. So I'm going to talk about policy and HR policy just in general on this one. So it feels like you have this feeling that PTO should have some rules to it, and other colleagues feel that PTO should have different rules to it, and you're pitching to change the HR policy to make different rules. For me, I think the question kind of goes down to like, what kind of employer do you want to be? And is there a true business reason for like harshing people's mellow on PTO? Because PTO is an employee benefit that when you hired these folks on, you said, hey, and when you come to work for us, you get, you get 2 weeks of PTO a year plus sick time or whatever, however you've got it structured. And then when they show up and they actually take it, you get all grumpy about it because like, well, that's not how you're supposed to do it, right? But if it's not in the policy and nobody agreed to that to begin with, you're just kind of being a jerk. So, I mean, my feeling, and I don't think that don't necessarily think that the year you were born has a lot to do with like how you interact with written policies. I think the policy is the policy. And it sounds like you think your policy is too lax and the policy needs to be worse. I would have that conversation and think about, again, what kind of employer do you want to be? Are there really true business reasons for having to make somebody give you a bunch of days to take the time off that they've officially technically earned based on the agreement that you have with that employee? Or do you want to do something different and sort of change the rules after people have already agreed to be there? That's just that's sort of an internal thing. I think, most people, if you are honest with them and say, look, the office has to be open on Wednesdays and everybody's asked for PTO on Wednesday, what are we going to do? Like, I think that's a reasonable question to ask. But to kind of make it like this third party, well, the policy says you have to ask for it two weeks in advance. And, Margaret's been here for 10 years and you've only been here for 2 years. So Margaret gets to take Christmas and you have to work on Christmas. So too bad, so sad, right? That just doesn't seem like, that just seems like you're being rude for the sake of being rude, and you need to like have an actual conversation about it. Like, maybe you shouldn't be open on Christmas. Maybe you don't need to have a presence in the office 24/7. So that's kind of my take. It's a grumpy one. What do you think, Stacey?
I definitely don't think this is a generational matter. So I guess I just want to start with that. It's very easy, I think, to fall into a trap that we look at someone who's different than ourselves, a different age, a different, race, different lived experience, whatever, a different background, and just start to attribute things that person does to that background instead of, okay, it's a broken system or we don't have a policy for it. So my sense here is that's what's happening. I also want to just say, I get your frustration when you are a certain person. I mean, I will say, when I was a staff member working at different nonprofits, I remember thinking, gosh, I'm so courteous. I'm so respectful. I'm so responsible. Like, I let my boss know a month in advance before I'm going to take off. I'm going to use my PTO because that feels like it's the right way to do it. It's the way I was raised, all that. I was that person, right? And I was young. I mean, I was in my 20s when I acted like that. So it had nothing to do, it had to do a lot with my background and how like a lot of other things that didn't have to do with it, the actual, generation. So I guess I would say to, kind of challenge yourself a little bit to that, because I think it's an easy trap to fall into, and it will make you miserable and those around you miserable if it becomes an age blame kind of thing. I'm not an HR expert. If I were running, an organization, I would definitely want some kind of a policy so we could plan accordingly. And maybe I'm more of a stickler and not nearly as mellow as Andy is about it. Like, I know you've earned it, but I also go for planning purpose. I'm a planner, right? So I would want to know, and I would want to make sure I didn't have multiple people out at the same time. And so, I think there's also, right, when people are planning a vacation and tell you kind of a few days before, and if they provide direct services to people in need, I find that irresponsible. So that's where I start to get a little bit in your corner on that. Feels just a little like, come on, like, that's not what we should do. That's not good practice. That's not good for our clients. And so I think there needs to be some structure and system and policy. And the questions that Andy brought up are really good ones. And that needs to get resolved, and this other stuff should shake out. And maybe you can kind of, try not to make it, and think about, you might want to start checking yourself at how many times you think about someone who behaves differently than you in the workplace, and how many times that is in your head pointed or attributed to their age, because that is a path that is not going to serve, I think, you or the organization long term.
Yeah. I think the only thing I'll say to sort of add on to that is there's a significant power dynamic difference between an employee and an employer. And this is true of any organization. It's not nonprofit specific. Nonprofits are more complex because now we have board members, which are completely different group, and donors, which are a completely different group. But the basic power dynamic between employers and employees is skewed way toward the employer. And in general, when people feel like they don't have control over their situation, they underperform. Like, so if you think about back in elementary school or whatever, because I've got younger kids and they're very obsessed with fairness. They're extremely obsessed with what's fair and what's not fair. They've got this inherent overdeveloped sense of what's fair. And I think as we age, like sometimes we chill on that a little bit. I know I've chilled on that a little bit, but the kids certainly haven't. But in general, most people are like, they want things to be equitable in some way. And so when we have an obvious power differential between two groups of people, I think it's important to just keep that in mind, that power differential exists, and that we want to make sure that we're not putting people in a position where they say, this isn't fair. And I feel like maybe in this scenario, you feel like it's not fair because you asked for time off like 2 weeks in advance and it was denied for whatever reason. And then this other person came in and just didn't show up and says, I'm taking PTO. And you feel like that's not fair. The thing about PTO is that it's a cheap way for organizations to merge sick time and vacation time. And the reason they do it is because people take less sick time. And if they feel sick, they're like, well, I don't want to burn my vacation because it's the same bucket. And so I'm going to go in when I'm sick, right? Which is stupid. Like, we all lived through COVID. We know how that worked out. Like, we want people to take the time off when they need the time off. Like, that's the right position to be. We created PTO with this pretend flexibility, but the real reason is it makes people go into the office more often. It makes people, because they don't want to burn their vacation. And so what happens is then you've incentivized the employees to pretend to be sick when they're not sick because they want to take vacation time. Why don't we just throw that all out the window and say, look, here's the rules. This is what we're trying to achieve. Like, don't be a jerk. Let's come up with a policy that we can all agree on that seems fair to everybody, including the employer and the employees and people who want to play by rules that they learned as children and people that just want to do what they want to do because they don't feel like coming to work today, right? We need to make sure that everybody kind of feels like it's all fair for everybody. I think if we can come up with something that's similar to that, I think everybody's going to be happier for sure.
Okay, Andy, this one's for you. As I move into the role of being our nonprofit's board treasurer, what additional risk do I have and what will the bank expect from me? I have heard that I'll need to provide personal information and be a signer, which makes me a bit unsettled. Will you help educate me about what and why I need to provide all of this personal information to the bank and whether it will impact my own credit score if the nonprofit defaults on payments on a line of credit? That's just one of many worst case scenarios that is running around my head. I realize how ridiculous this may all sound and appreciate any help you can provide.
Oh man, I know this feeling, and I've had this conversation with potential board treasurers over the years too. It's definitely not one that's it's definitely not that uncommon. So I'm going to break it up into a couple of pieces. And one is sort of the liability piece. Like, when you're signing on to be the board treasurer of a nonprofit organization, like what is the worst case scenario for you? And the worst case scenario, if there is gross negligence, and that's a high bar. So gross negligence means that people were intentionally screwing up and doing it on purpose and trying to steal things and that kind of stuff. If they can prove gross negligence, then yeah, as a board member, you can be on the hook for things that the nonprofit did badly. One of the ways you keep that from happening, so one of the things you need to make sure that your nonprofit has is D&O insurance, which is directors and officers insurance. So what D&O insurance does for you is it provides a level of sort of a barrier between somebody that's trying to sue the nonprofit for malpractice or negligence or anything like that, and the board of trustees. So you're basically ensuring the board of trustees that the insurance company is going to step in and at least make the process fair. So as a board member, it's still your responsibility. You can't just join a board and be like, I don't know anything, right? Let you guys do what you want. Like, you still have a responsibility. You have a fiduciary responsibility, which means that you need to make sure that the organization is doing the things that they need to be doing properly. Like, all the governance things need to be done properly. All the finance things need to be done properly. Are you following your agreements for the board, for the Form 990? all of that kind of stuff. You still need to do the work. It doesn't protect you from just being lazy. But it does provide a layer of protection that if you are doing things the right way, that you're not going to probably be on the hook. So that's that side of it. So 100% make sure you've got D&O insurance, because that's going to protect you from things happening. The other side of it is it's a sort of signer thing. So in many organizations, when you become, depending on the size of the organization, when you're the board treasurer, they may ask you to be the signer on the bank account and things like that. It's usually more common in smaller organizations because because the board treasurer is an officer of the organization and they want an officer's signature. Back in the old days, back when we had to like write checks, sometimes organizations, and some still do, which is hilarious, but sometimes organizations would have rules that for checks over a certain amount, you needed to have 2 signatures on it. And so the staff would go running around chasing down board members to get that second signature on the check. So a lot of times the sort of that may just sort of be a legacy process from something that your organization used to do 25 years ago, that with sort of modern tools like Positive Pay or direct deposit or ACH or the things that you're probably using now to pay bills, like signer doesn't really mean anything anymore. It just means that as the board treasurer, your name is on the account. I'm not aware of any banks like hitting credit reports for like becoming a signer on the account. They're going to ask you for personal information because they want to be sure that you really are who you say you are. They're going to want to see probably a copy of the bylaws. They might want to see the board minutes that show when you were inducted as the treasurer so that you can officially be on the account. And that's just to protect the bank from somebody walking in and saying, hey, I'm the new treasurer of XYZ organization, so now I'm going to drain the account, right? So that's really just to protect the bank, to make sure that they're not giving away money they shouldn't be giving away. I think in general, if the organization's run well, you're in very, the likelihood that something's going to affect you personally is very, very low, especially if you're doing your job and making sure that everybody's, doing the things that they're supposed to be doing in terms of reporting and, not cheating and that kind of stuff as well. Your auditor will help you with that as well. Check the audit, look at the audit findings if you've had any audit findings, and that should give you either a sense of security or some panic about what you're really going to be on the hook for with this organization.
Is there anything, Andy? I mean, you talked about there's not a lot to worry about if an organization is already well run, but you and I both know there are organizations that are not well run and financially don't have expertise, and perhaps don't have. I mean, they have maybe some of the basics in place, but aren't what you would define as, quote, well run. So in those situations, they still need a board treasurer. Do you think it's a recipe for disaster for someone to sign up to be a board treasurer of an organization like that? I mean, because that's the reality. It exists out there, right? So What does someone do? What does an organization do in that situation?
So I think if I were asked to be the board treasurer someplace, what I would ask to see is the most recent audited financial statements prepared by an auditor, as well as the management letter. So what that is when you get an audit, the auditor gives you the official audit, which usually says like, it's fine, it should. And then in addition, there's a letter that goes on top of it that the board gets. It's really for management and board to look at, to say like, as auditors, everything was fine, but here's some things I think you should work on, right? It's really the additional information that can make things stronger. I would ask for both of those things. And in the management letter, I would look for some red flags that the auditor may be bringing up about, like, we've asked you about internal controls for the last 3 years and your internal controls still aren't quite to the level that we want them to be. Or, sort of repeat findings, things that happened last year that also happened this year, or happened 3 years ago and also happened 2 years ago and also happened this year. That tells me that the organization isn't really paying attention, because that management letter, when somebody tells you something like you need to work on this, the first thing you'd expect in a good organization is for them to be like, we are not going to see this again. Like, this should not be on next year's report. We're going to take care of it and make sure that what the auditor said we need to work on, we're working on. Unless it's absurd. Like sometimes auditors just don't know what they're doing. But for the most part, that management letter should really give you a sense of comfort about how much risk am I truly in. And then if you don't feel comfortable based on what you've seen in the audit and what you've seen on the management letter, then say, no, thank you. I don't feel comfortable being your treasurer, right? I don't think that I have enough control over this organization to make sure that I am personally not at risk when I agree to this role. So it's a perfectly legitimate thing to say if you do not feel comfortable. And at that point, the organization should panic because they don't ever want to be in a position where a board member is not comfortable with their financial situation or how they're managing things.
So, question, Andy, you mentioned earlier, I'm just sort of feeding into this, thinking about what some of our listeners may be thinking of as they hear your responses. So you talked about oftentimes having, quote, a signer on a bank account is more typical for smaller organizations. So for a mid-sized or larger organization, does the treasurer still need to be a part of any paperwork tied to the bank, or usually you don't see that?
Usually you want to update your banks with when the officers of the organization change, you want to let the bank know that the officers of the organization changed. But there's no rule or requirement that the treasurer or anybody on the board needs to be a signer on the bank account. They don't necessarily need to be writing checks. Matter of fact, I'd say from a strict, and you probably agree with this too, from a strict governance perspective, like the board's job is not to write checks.
Exactly.
So they shouldn't be necessarily so that shouldn't be like an automatic thing. Again, I think that's kind of a legacy sort of, we've always had the new treasurer as a signer on the bank account, like because we've always done it. And you probably don't necessarily have to if you've got staff that's doing that and you have enough staff to be able to manage your internal controls properly. So what this is when you're paying somebody, you need to make sure that what we call is like a three-way match, that what we said we were going to pay for, like what we agreed to pay for initially, did we get the service, and does the invoice match those two pieces of information? So what did we ask for? What did we get? And does the invoice say that on it? Like that's the three-way match. And as long as you have more than one person reviewing that information, so ideally it's three, right? There's a person that ordered it. They agree, yeah, this is what we ordered. The person that received it, yeah, we've matched that what we received was what we ordered. And then the person paying it, yeah, we agree that the invoice says what it is that they delivered. So as long as you've got multiple eyeballs on that, and it's not all the same person, you've kind of got that internal control piece covered. And there's no reason to bring the board into it. I mean, that's just like extra people who are not interested in being involved.
Right. And I think board members, I mean, you mentioned having people say this, people wanting to become board treasurer, bring this up to you before. I mean, it comes up for me a lot. Like people are nervous about personally being on the hook for things they have no control over and from an operational perspective. And so there is this huge reluctance, and I get that reluctance, but I guess that goes back to also what you were saying about governance and fiduciary duty. Like if you there's some organizations that don't have an audited financial statement, right? Because they're not large enough yet. And so that's a whole other thing that then what do you do, right? Because you're a small organization. I mean, there's just a lot of layers to this and a lot of other unique circumstances.
Yeah, and that's one of the things you have to think about. We're a really tiny baby organization. If you don't have an audit, if there's not professional staff doing things, yeah, you're on the hook as the treasurer, but the risk is kind of low because you're not big enough to have an auditor and you're not big enough to have staff. So, there's certainly a trade-off, and it's a great question. Is like, what am I agreeing to? You need to be super clear before you say okay. Congratulations, you made it to the end of another episode of Nonprofit Everything. Thank you again for taking the time to listen to the podcast. Thank you for sending in your questions. Thank you for suggesting guest experts. Again, the easiest way to do that, I think, is to go to the Nonprofit Everything webpage and click the Ask a Question button, and you can type it in right there. Or you can get to Stacey and I any other way that you can find us. We're everywhere, just like everyone else. So ask us those questions, and we will be back in 2 weeks and answer some more.